It's an absolute pleasure to have them both with us today. So if I start with the questions, and I'm going to direct it towards Dorothy, first of all. As we know, life doesn't go according to plan. So is there a benefit towards planning your career and setting your agenda in that regards from your experience?
In a short, yes, I do think there is benefit in planning, but you don't need to be wed to your plan. So you mentioned that I work at Finsbury Glover Hering, but I actually started my career off in banking. So I had a plan then that was laid out that I was going to work in banking for 2 years. I was going to take the LSATs, was going to become a lawyer, and lots of other things about investing in the community in America, where I'm from. But I got an opportunity to move to London, and that set things in motion for me to make a lot of other changes that came along in my life. But having a plan in place helped me get to a stage where I was setting up phases for me to learn and also getting to know myself. Part of the planning process is asking yourself really smart questions to really understand what it is that you're looking to achieve, the type of growth that you're looking to have, because your career isn't just about milestones. It's all about experience and what it is that you are trying to develop in yourself over that time frame. So I do think it's good to plan, but if your plan does not go in lockstep, that's also okay.
I just realized I got really, really excited about the session and actually forgot to ask about your background and like your position and how you got to this situation. So if you don't mind, can I take a step back and actually ask you to explain a bit more about who you are and your background and how you got it?
Sure. So I just mentioned that I actually started my career in banking. So I was born in America. I grew up there. I started my career at Goldman Sachs, and I worked in investment banking there for 3 years and got an opportunity to move to London and did another 3 years in banking. Now, my first 3 years were blissful. My second 3 years were not as blissful because I started to realize that I wanted to do something else, but couldn't quite figure out what that was. So in 2008, I took some time out. I did acting classes, met some really cool people like Michaela Cole, and also decided that I was going to go back to where my true heart lied, in communications, because I originally wanted to either go into PR or journalism, and happened to join what was then called Finsbury, and said I'd try it for 3 months and see how it went. And 13 years later, I am there and sit on board.
Wow, what a journey. Christina, do you mind sharing your story today and giving us a bit more about your background?
Yeah, for sure. And hi, everyone. Good morning or good afternoon, and thanks for joining. I think that my story also ties nicely into the question you asked, Dennis. You know, I started at JP Morgan about 16 years ago as a summer intern, and ultimately took a job in corporate derivative marketing for interest rates right out of college. And, you know, when I was in college, I thought I was going to be a doctor. So already my plan was kind of out the window right when I started my career. So I helped corporations manage their interest rate risk for about 4.5 years. And then 4.5 years later, I switched over to covering institutional clients, which was a much faster pace, more traditional sales job on the trading floor. And then 9 years into my career at JP Morgan, I decided that I was kind of, you know, fatigued from, I think, a number of things, including culture of, you know, the trading floor and, you know, the kind of fast-paced intensity of the environment. So I took a sabbatical, which was, you know, it was wonderful that the company was willing to work with me and give me this time off, so that not dissimilar from Dorothy, I went to acting school. I was writing a novel, so I entered into a 2-year program for acting, and ultimately came back a year into that program part-time in the sales group. I'd, you know, at that point given up all of my accounts. I took a major step back from responsibility within the sales and trading world, and, you know, including a massive pay cut so I could pursue my creative interests. And then, you know, flash forward, I did that for about 5 years, just kind of supporting on the sales desk. And, you know, George Floyd happened. And for me, it was this amazing, I guess, call to action and wake up call that I could personally do a lot more, having been at the firm for 15 years, because I just didn't think Black representation was where it needed to be. I didn't think the culture was where it needed to be. And I was very vocal about this within my area of the organization, because I think the trading floor is its own beast in terms of kind of driving change and culture. So, you know, me sharing a personal story across the trading floor ultimately led to some conversations with senior management, and a group of, you know, senior Black salespeople proposed the idea it would be good to have somebody who understood the business to help drive change. So I ultimately became the Black Advocacy Chair of all of our global markets businesses last year. Have been doing that for a year, and I'm focused within that role on advocating for better representation, better retention, and better culture, which will hopefully be a model that can be kind of scaled and translated to all underrepresented groups at the firm.
Fantastic. You mentioned in your journey a little bit around change. So how do you adapt effectively to the changing situations and priorities at work?
Yeah, I think, you know, being able to adapt to change is one of the most important things you can do in your career. I think if I had been rigidly, you know, like Dorothy said, if I had been rigidly fixed to any plan, I think my entire journey would not have been possible. I would have been kind of miserably wedded to a path in med school, which would not have been a good fit for me. So I think it's really important to remain dynamic and to be willing to consider opportunities and options that were not envisioned in your plan or in the pathway that you thought you were going to have. I never would have expected that I would be taking on a DEI role at JP Morgan, 15 years into my career. It was nothing I had originally envisioned or even necessarily aspired to do, but my experience evolved and changed, and I saw an opportunity to really do something that I was passionate about and that I thought would, make a meaningful impact, and kind of also wedded all of my interests, including creative and, business aspirations. And I think it's also really important to be willing to perhaps take some risk within that too, which I think is very much the theme of our conversation. And, the risk I took was to give up all of these accounts, to take a pay cut for the sake of pursuing something different.
It's interesting because you touched on this wasn't really in your plan. Your current role was not in your plan. So, and you touched on a few of those points, but for other people, we like to think that we need to make sure that we're doing things in a straight line. When you're thinking about your opportunities and your next moves, sometimes opportunities present themselves in different ways. In your opinion, Christina, does it make sense to take a sideward step in order to make that forward progression, even if you can't see it? Or is it, let's just focus on seeing how high I can get, how fast I can get, let me just continue to build and move forward from there?
Yeah, so I think at every point where I did change roles at JP Morgan, and I guess I'm unique because I've basically grown up at the same company, which I think has its benefits and drawbacks. But at every point where I made a change, and I've made a number of changes, that involves some sort of moment where I needed to take a moment to grow, learn, and understand what the new opportunity set was. And I wasn't necessarily accelerating at the same speed as where I was previously. But every time I did that was certainly a worthwhile venture. It ultimately led to a much higher level of growth. I think ultimately a higher trajectory, regardless of whether or not that was about kind of just going up the corporate ladder. It ultimately aligned better and got me to a place where I was doing something that I cared about much more. And I think, if you stay at one company like I did, part of the reason why your plan might change is you start to see and understand where there are gaps better once you sit in one place for a long time. You start to understand where you can add value as an individual at a giant corporation. So that was kind of really important for me to take that feedback I was getting just from my experience, and be willing to kind of evolve with how I could contribute and change the environment and add some value overall. So I guess, to succinctly answer your question, definitely, I think it is sometimes worth taking a step back to take a step forward. That's kind of how you stay invigorated in your career. That's how you continue to learn. And that's where risk really starts to pay off.
Following on from that, Dorothy, when you're looking at your role and what it entails, how do you assess whether what you're doing now actually has long-term value?
It's a good question, Dennis. I think for that, there's two sides to that. There's the institutional side. Does it have institutional value for whatever company I'm working for or organization? And then there's the personal side. If we look at the company side, you need to understand what is actually the strategy, what is the goal that they're trying to achieve, and try to map, even in those small ways, how your role or your department ladders up to that ultimate goal. But if we think about it on a personal note, and most of us are here thinking about ourselves, I like to ask myself one simple question, and it's, what am I learning? And so I may not be learning a new technical skill, because a lot of times when you move from being entry level to management level, you're not learning as many technical skills as you are learning other skills that make you a better decision maker in a business, a better people manager, a better visionary, someone who's able to set strategy yourself. So it could be understanding what it takes to motivate a team. Am I being put in a position to develop a skill that I know will benefit me if I'm going to build a business underneath this umbrella? I'm learning how to think more strategically about setting objectives and targets and financial goals for a business? Is that something that is actually going to be useful for me and what I am trying to achieve in my career? All of those softer skills and some harder skills are things that you learn at different stages. And if you get to a point where you are no longer learning anything, that's when I think from a personal perspective, it's probably not paying you any dividends anymore.
Talking about paying and money, obviously we all do jobs for financial reasons. From your perspective, Dorothy, is talking about money a career risk? And how do you ensure that over time you're being compensated appropriately? Yeah,
first of all, you need to know your worth. And so talking about money is not a career risk. There's obviously a way to do it in order for you to have an ear that's actually listening as opposed to shutting you down. Hopefully, most people are in organizations that have formal processes in place, formal review processes where you can have that conversation on an annual, semi-annual basis. But when you don't, I think it's also about making sure that you have external benchmarks for the type of role you are doing, either trying to do it online with Glassdoor or having recruiters that you talk to on a regular basis, not necessarily because you're looking for a job, but because it's good to actually understand what data points are out there and what you are actually worth, and being able to bring that to the table alongside evidence of your performance in the business or the organization. Because if you are helping them achieve their goals and you understand that you aren't being compensated in the same way that you would if you achieve those same goals elsewhere, then obviously there's something that needs to be done. Now, it's often the case if you stay somewhere for a very long time that you end up being underpaid versus other people, unless you have that conversation regularly, which is why I say it's not a bad thing. Because people who jump jobs every 2 years, every 4 years, they're constantly being re-rated and reevaluated. And so you have to create an opportunity for yourself to make sure that that happens, either when you have your formal review, or if that doesn't happen, setting up a conversation with your manager, whoever that is, and saying, I'd really like to talk about how I'm developing, what I'm delivering, and what that actually means for us as a business.
Interesting. Christina, do you have any thoughts which you'd want to add on to that? Because I know that you have lots of conversations with people about money.
Yes, I feel really strongly about this. I would echo a lot of the things that Dorothy's already said. I wish that someone had sat me down and talked to me about how to approach conversations about how I was compensated at a very early stage. I just think it's worth knowing that typically, I think the trend is that women and minorities do not typically broach this subject or ask as often as our colleagues who may not be underrepresented. So I think it's super important to know that these conversations are happening. So whether or not you are uncomfortable, which you most likely will be, it's really uncomfortable to talk about conversations and fight for your own worth. I think it's like just worth knowing that everyone's uncomfortable doing it. But it's essential that you do it. You are working, and if you're not making sure that you're getting rewarded appropriately, you cannot assume that someone's going to do that on your behalf. So I wish that someone had really impressed upon me at the early stage of my career that this is something you need to get comfortable doing every single year. You need to ask and know your worth. You need to do research. You need to conduct that in whatever means you can do. I know that in my business, it's not something that's really kind of a clear cut. They're not giving you like a clear cut science for how you're necessarily getting compensated. So it's something you kind of have to do some digging on for yourself. So definitely do that work because it's worth it. You're working so hard. And it's this one moment for us, at least every year, when you might have a conversation about it, or you might have a manager who's not bringing you up and letting you in on how they're making the decision. So I think that one thing that is really helpful that I encourage, all of our employees to do here is to rehearse those conversations with someone. It's really much easier to make the ask once you practice it, said it out loud, gotten comfortable saying it, and you have that data to back you up. Like, this is what I've done. This is what I know the market's at. This is what I'm worth. This is where I could potentially get paid somewhere else. So it becomes a very, unemotional conversation, and one in which you're pretty confident that this is what you need to get in order to be happy to remain wherever you are, in your current career. So absolutely, conversations, get comfortable talking about money, because, that's why most of us work for, we work for other reasons, but like at the end of the day, if you're working in corporate, a corporate environment, like you want to get paid appropriately, and you definitely don't want to be getting underpaid versus peers, which very much could be the case if you're not having these conversations and holding yourself accountable to have them.
Wholeheartedly agree. One thing you mentioned there, Christina, is that you had to learn about change and you had to embed that into your career. But Dorothy, picking up on that, obviously change is a constant throughout everyone's career. How do you embed that philosophy of change into your personal agenda for career success?
Yeah, I think of myself as really, really lucky where I am right now, because I've got a really supportive team and we've got a very entrepreneurial culture. And so when I want to pick up a new project, I have a lot of latitude and leeway to be able to do so. But I think it's also a bit about mindset. So I stopped quite a long time ago looking at my career as a lockstep. I need to climb this rung in order for me to be able to say that I'm actually achieving something. And many of us who go into what I call the formula jobs, so going into banking, going into law, going into consulting, where every 2 or 3 years I'm supposed to achieve this thing, we get very locked into that's the only way that you can value yourself and value your self-worth. But there's so many more things that you want to develop. If you think about, all the different aspects of your personal development that you need to get in the 24 hours a day, and we spend 8 to 12 of them sitting in front of a computer for somebody's job. There's a lot of development that you can have. And so for me, it's about making sure that I'm in an environment that allows me to put my hand up and say, this is something I'd like to do. And then being able to find a way to carve that out for me, either as a project that I do on the side of my job or building it into my role. So I started out when I joined Finsbury Glover Hering, I came from banking. And so all the assignments I got were banking related. It's IR related. I was doing the same thing over and over and over again. And I got super bored. So, and I really wanted to get more into marketing. So I put my hand up and said, this is what I would like to do. I'd like to build it into my role. And now my role sitting on the global board is to be global head of marketing. I rebranded the business, and I hadn't done marketing before I reignited that fire since my MBA. But having that trust and being able to convince people that I could do it, and also doing a bit of training and research, enabled me to be able to spread my wings a bit and feel like I wasn't just running on a treadmill.
Christina, how valuable is it to compare yourself to your peers who are also looking to progress? Do you use that as a benchmark, as motivation, or is that detrimental to your career?
Yeah, so I think that there are a couple ways where comparing yourself to others can be helpful. I just talked about compensation. Having some understanding of where your peers are getting paid is very important, I think. But I also think that this can also hold one back to some extent in a number of ways. What I would say is I came, to JP Morgan on the trading floor 15 years ago. It's a predominantly white male environment. So I am a person who doesn't look like a lot of the people who I would work with. And if I compared myself to them and assumed that I'd have to be like them, I think that could be incredibly limiting. So, I think rather than try to think of myself as like the only one and someone who didn't fit in, which, oftentimes I would come home with those feelings, I tried to kind of like think of that as all my difference and my superpower to some extent, particularly as a salesperson, because I think it would be really easy to kind of get bogged down with the fact that I walk into meetings sometimes and I could just feel the sense that, what is this like, young woman who, we can't really fit into a box. Like, what does she have to offer me? Like, I'm much more used to talking to this other person. I know what he looks like. I know what he says. Like, I understand who that person is. So I could, I think there were times when I'd get a little bit bogged down with like me versus my peers and just not necessarily being taken seriously or necessarily having, credibility walk in the door with me. But instead, I just tried to push all of those feelings aside and use that as my, unique difference in how I could contribute a view to people that was something that they weren't hearing otherwise. So I think if I had got bogged down in those comparisons, it would not necessarily have been helpful. And I think, another way where I see people comparing themselves to others and limiting their career trajectories is by saying like, well, the firm has never let this thing happen. No one else around me has been able to do that. So I'm just going to assume that that's not possible. I think my dad has never worked in corporate America. He's like a singer. I'm from Vegas originally. And so he has no real experience in navigating this world, but the best piece of advice he ever gave me, and it's like something, I think it's kind of like my motto that I live by, is the worst that can happen if you ask for something is someone says no. And then what? You like move on, you get over it, no big deal. And I have like really taken that on board. And I think that that's why I've been able to kind of like navigate my career how I have, is I'm just willing to ask for like anything. It doesn't matter to me if it's never happened before. It doesn't matter if my peers are not asking for it. When I tell people I work part-time at JP Morgan on the trading floor, like usually they're often like, well, my company would never do that. I didn't know they did that. It's like, well, they didn't, but then I asked for it and I made a proposal that was compelling and ultimately they agreed to it. Or, being able to kind of pivot to this new role, to create a new role as the advocacy chair. That's something that's never happened before either. But I don't think like it would have happened if I had limited my ask by what others were doing around me. So I do think it's important to look and see, what you're kind of up against, what is considered to be a good performer in your role, what is considered to be a poor performer, so that you can advocate for yourself and, demand for your promotion when you deserve it, get compensated accordingly. But do not be limited by the pathways of others. Define your own pathway and don't be afraid to ask for something. Like, that's another uncomfortable thing for a lot of us. But again, when you want to ask for something that's outside of the box, rehearse it, prepare for it. The art of how you ask is really incredibly important. So I think it's worth, again, spending time on and being creative about how you can make a really rewarding career for you that serves your needs, gives you work-life balance, compensates you how you need to be compensated.
Great. I did have a couple more questions, but what I'm going to try to do is open it up to the floor because I can see we have a few in the Q&A. So the first one is from Keela. To what extent do female-specific considerations, i.e. biological clock, have an impact on your willingness to take strategic risks? And how do you navigate this? Who would like to take this question?
Well, I can start it off, Dorothy. I mean, I would love to hear Dorothy's response too, because I don't know if we'll have different perspectives on this or perhaps the same perspective. But I don't have children. I'm single currently, and I think my perspective on this is I'm comfortable with that and okay with it. I can't speak for anyone else's experience or the decision making they make around this type of a question, because for me, like, it was never a priority necessarily to have children. What I would say is, like, I do have faith that kind of like things will work out. I mean, having faith is important, I think, in just life in general, to kind of like get through difficult times. But I do have faith that kind of like things are going to work out how they should work out. So I've always prioritized like what I think makes me happiest and what is most meaningful to me in my life. And what's most meaningful to me at this moment is to have time to like carve out space for my creative aspirations and interests. And that's why I work 3 days a week. That's like why I took a massive pay cut to work part-time. I think like a quarter of what I was making before I started working part-time. And for me, that was worth it, because my passion and what kind of keeps me ticking is being able to kind of continue to work on and carve out space for my dreams. And I think that could be applied to wanting to be a mother or having a family. If that is like your priority, that's your passion, I think there are ways to carve out space for that in your life. So I think it just comes down to like, what are you really after? What drives you, and carving out space for it in your life and thinking about creative ways that you can work with your employer to do that.
Great. Dorothy, is there anything you want to add to that?
We are in a similar situation. So Christina and I have probably similar views on life, because I'm also a woman who is single and I don't have children by choice. So I think for me, that biological clock has not been a specific issue, because I've chosen not to have kids. I'm going to just say, as a woman who actually manages other women and also works for other women, that I have seen people make choices that I would consider risky if I were bringing on another cost center in my life really soon, and be very successful at it. So I don't think that it is a given that if you're about to have a child or thinking about having children, that all of a sudden you can't change jobs, you can't level up on your job. We've hired many people who were on maternity leave, and they came into the business and they hit the ground running and they were super happy to be back at work. So I don't necessarily think that should be a limiting factor. A lot of the times it's in our heads.
Yeah, and I would just add too, I mean, like, most of the senior women that I work with have families, have children. So it's like, have taken a step away from work so that they could, take care of their families and then come back and had no kind of ramifications and have been very successful. So I think there are lots of examples of women who are able to manage both a family and, a pretty successful career.
Great. 2 more quick questions. The first one is from Jordan. When would be the best time to ask for a promotion or pay rise within an organization?
I'll go first this time. I try to do it when I'm being benchmarked and evaluated, because I definitely have my data then, because they are giving me what they think of my performance. That said, there are going to be other times that it may come up, because during your benchmarking, you may not have had a specific achievement happen, and you'll have to take a judgment as to whether or not there's going to be an open ear, or if your organization is more rigid and says we only give pay rises at the time of performance evaluation. But at the point that you feel strongest about your performance is the best time, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there has always been a time of year where we kind of like talk. There's a whole process here for compensation determinations, and there's also kind of a typical pathway for promotion. So like after X number of years, you become eligible to get to the next level. So I think if that kind of structure exists for you at your firm, make sure you know about it. Make sure you know if you are promotion eligible. If it's not as structured, get a sense of like the people around you. How many years have they spent at a given level of seniority? Is that in sync with your current time spent? And is it worth discussing. I think it's just worth always discussing and knowing, like, when are you eligible and what is typical in your environment. So knowledge, again, is definitely power as far as this goes. That's the same thing for raises and asking for, an increase in pay. Knowing what's going on around you is really important to be able to negotiate. And I think you should have a regular discussion. Like I said, I think you should definitely have at least an annual discussion about compensation with your manager and understand how they're determining your pay.
Can I just add one thing? I think around the promotion piece, a lot of times people will ask for their promotion a little too late in the process, and they don't have the advocates lined up to make sure that they're backing them. And so that's something you're cultivating throughout the year. You don't just start that the week before promotion and say, hey, my evaluation's next week. Can you say something for me? Well, as you're working with people and you do a good job, you make sure that you're keeping that relationship up. You may only work with that person on a project from January to March, and you're evaluated in December. Make sure that you're keeping in touch with them, letting them know what's going on throughout the year. And as you're in the months and weeks approaching, say, these are my aspirations. What do you think about it? Get them involved and invested in your career, because then they will feel like you are their horse to back, and they will therefore be there for you when it's time for them to actually write that review.
Great. And quickly, the final question, because I know we're just running out of time. So you've had the conversation about pay, but they don't increase your salary and may provide credible excuses like COVID, etc. What do you do next?
Yeah, I think, if you're feeling really pigeonholed in your current level of compensation, the best way to go about dealing with that is to explore the market and to get some other offers to see what's available to you. So if you can go start having conversations with competitors, or a headhunter is a great person to engage to get a sense of what opportunities might exist. And, this is something I haven't actually left JP Morgan. So Dorothy, can probably chime into this, but I think this is something I've seen a lot of people do successfully within JP Morgan, is they get an offer somewhere else where they get paid significantly more. And if the firm values you, they're going to try to counter offer to keep you to stay. So it's not something you can do every single year and go into your boss's door and say, like, hey, I've got this offer away, can you match it? Because people want commitment. They want someone who's not going to be like 1 foot in, 1 foot out. But it is certainly something you can do to get yourself to the next level of compensation. And it's a very effective tool and strategy. So it all goes back to like the same, I think, bit of advice is just know the market and know your worth and know what's in your power to negotiate.
Yes, that is a tried and true path. So I have no arguments there. I would just caution that unless you are pretty sure that you are willing to go to that place that gave you the offer, just tread lightly on it, because I have seen people just say bye, and the person might be just a little bit sad that they left their current organization to go somewhere else.
Great. Well, thank you for that really interesting session. One question before you both go. If people wanted to follow you on social media or get in contact, what's the best way to do that for you both?
I'm pretty active on LinkedIn, Dorothy Burwell, very easy to find.
I'm on LinkedIn as well, Christina Trotter, on Instagram as ctrotter8.
Great, perfect. Thank you so much for your time. This was a really